Today is December 3rd, 2019. I'm Adrienne Falaise, and it is my honor to be here with Lori Openden for the Interviews, an Oral History of Television. And we are at Television Academy headquarters in North Hollywood, California. All right. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Lori.
I'm glad to be here. I'm honored that you asked, and I'm honored to be a part of all of this.
It's going to be great. So we like to start just by getting a little bit of background information. So first question is, what was your name at birth?
My name at birth was Lori. My middle name is Robin, and my last name was Linder, L-I-N-D-E-R. And I changed to Openden when I got married later in my life.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Los Angeles, California, at a hospital called Cedars of Lebanon, which is now Cedars-Sinai, which was the big birthing center of Los Angeles in the 50s when I was born.
And tell us a little bit about your childhood. What was your family like?
I grew up in an area called Baldwin Hills, which is South LA, and it was a small neighborhood. It was actually a very sweet neighborhood, and I stayed there through high school until I went away to college. We lived there for a long time. And I had a mother and father. I have an older sister. My father died when I was 12 years old, and what that did is create a very strong work ethic in my sister and I. And we babysat, we had odd jobs, we did everything we could, and always had a very strong work ethic because we wanted to get by and we wanted to create a better life for ourselves. And that's what I did. I went to high school. I went to University High School, which is out of the area, transferred there. And then I went to Cal State Northridge, where I majored in radio, television, film. And then started working in the industry after I graduated.
So when you were little, what were some of your interests? Were you interested in TV and radio?
I always loved TV. I don't know, radio for music. At that time, there wasn't podcasts. There wasn't anything interesting like that. So that was for music. And I loved music, and I listened to a lot of it. But I always loved television. I loved movies. I loved literature. And where my career was headed, later on, looking back on it, I did always have an attraction for the performing arts. And in school, I was in the school plays. I worked background, stage manager. I acted. I didn't have a voice for singing, but I did the musicals in high school, like so many of actors and cast directors are known for doing.
What about TV shows? What were some of your favorite shows?
I loved the comedies. I loved Bonanza. I thought the guys were great. I loved, I don't know, I should have prepared for that. I don't think of what I used to like. It's a long time ago. But I just loved television in general.
Yeah. So what about when you got to college? Did you continue doing plays and behind-the-scenes things?
I didn't do plays. By the time I went to college, I majored in radio, television, film. And I had a short time where I wanted to be a journalist, an on-camera journalist, and I realized very quickly that that was not a good choice. And in radio, television, film, we got to work behind the scenes, running cameras, running lights, everything that, every crew position for television. We also had classes in programming and writing and educational broadcasting and network broadcasting, and it was a lot of fun. And at the time, it was just after the Vietnam War, and in my major at Cal State Northridge, there was 200 majors in radio, television, film. 190 were men and 10 were women. And now, of course, it's much reversed, and it's a huge major, and it's a lottery to get into the major because it's gotten very, very popular. But it was a good place to go to school. I was financially challenged, so I was unable to go away to school to somewhere I might have liked to go. But Northridge was good because we had a lot of good guest speakers and guest teachers and professors at the college who worked in the industry. So we got a lot of firsthand knowledge about what was going on, although I do feel I learned most of what I know after graduation.
Are there any names that you remember of visiting professors or anything?
No.
That's totally fine.
I don't.
What was it like being one of the only women in your program?
Oh, I loved it. It was a lot of fun. And the guys were a lot from the service. They were on the GI Bill, and they had done ham radios and radio broadcasting and television camera work in the service, and so that was a natural major. So it was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it a lot. I loved going to college, and I loved the major.
So when you graduated, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do?
Not at all. I remember wanting to be a production assistant, not knowing that that was an entry-level job. But my first job after college was at the William Morris Agency in Beverly Hills. It's now William Morris Endeavor, but that was before the merger. And I worked for a television agent, and that's where I really was able to learn my passion for television programming. And I learned a lot at the William Morris Agency, mostly about how the whole town works. And I used to be able to write, take notes for minutes for the television meetings. And so I got to know all the agents, and I just was able to learn everything that goes on in television there. And you have to remember, this was way before computers. We didn't even have a Xerox machine. We used this thing called an A.B. Dick videograph machine that we did. And so you were very involved in everything, and I was able to read everything and know what was going on. And I was very friendly with all the people I spoke to on the phone, which were mostly also secretaries. We were not called assistants, we were called secretaries. And one day, somebody I was friendly on the phone, I never met her in person, said, "Oh, Lori, this is so great. We just got to pick up, we're going to be doing Barney Miller. We did the pilot, and we're going to do 13 episodes. And I said, "Oh, that's great. You're going to need more secretaries over there." So she says, "Hold on a second." And she came back and she said, "Okay, they want to meet you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." And I got that job. And that's how I made my transition out of the agency into television production. At the agency, I learned that I did not want to be an agent. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but it was not to be an agent. So on the Barney Miller set, we were a very small production, and I worked for the casting director and one of the producers, and an executive in charge of production, meaning the guy that did the budgets and the hiring. And so I learned, again, how a television show works. But the casting director I work for is where I really felt a connection. And I was very involved with her in picking the actors for Barney Miller. And we just had that one show, very focused, and it was mostly character actors. And that's where I was able to learn casting and to realize that this was a good place for me. I had a very strong memory for names, which I had always had, and I was able to remember people, and I learned to start being critical of performances and to get to know how the agency representation works, which is really important in casting. And I learned a lot from Danny Arnold, my first boss on the show, who was really wonderful at casting, and not to mention comedy, which is what he was known for. And I just was able to learn so much about television from that first job.
So what was the name of the casting director that you worked under?
Her name was Beth Uffner, and she was wonderful and very collaborative with me. She later on became an agent, became very famous and very rich, and retired lovely in New York, and she's a happy person.
So how did she kind of show you the ropes? I mean, did you shadow her, or what was?
I shadowed her. We talked about actors. We had auditions. There again, it was videotape was just not at our disposal. We didn't. I remember wanting to show Danny Arnold film, and I literally had to take pieces of paper and paper the film at the scene I wanted him to see. That was literally how we did it, with little chunks of yellow paper sticking out of the film reel. And so everything like that was not accessible to us the way it is now. And we had auditions, and we auditioned different actors. We knew the kinds of actors we needed for Barney Miller. And I was just very much aware of watching the auditions and watching the people we hired on the set to learn about the skills and the craft of acting.
So how would it actually start? Would you get a script for the episode and then go through it, or?
On most of the other shows I cast, yes. On Barney Miller, the scripts were always very, very late. And I would go to Danny Arnold and say, well, you know, it's Thursday. We have another episode starting on Monday. Can you tell me who's in it? What guest stars you'll need? And he would literally describe them to me. And he'd say, remember the guy we had who was in the jail who stole the pizza? And I said, yeah, somebody like that. And that was how we communicated about the actors. And very often on Monday morning, I would come to work, and we were supposed to have a table reading, and I would call the actors and tell them not to come in, their lines were not written yet. And this was every week like that, and we shot on Friday nights, and somehow it got done. The scripts got written, the show got shot, and the show was a big success. But it was a very odd way of casting, which we never would do now.
And how many kind of rounds of auditions, and who had the final say on yes, that kind of thing?
Danny Arnold had the final say on yes. We would bring actors in to audition for him, and he would choose the people that he liked. I think with Beth and I giving our input, and but he knew what he wanted, and he really, really knew comedy, and he could make people funny. So if he saw a glimmer of something, he would go with that actor and then right toward them. And we had a lot of great talent and a lot of very, very funny people on the show.
So you had said you learned to be critical of performances. How did you build that skill?
By watching and listening. A lot of actors, it's just natural. They're just naturally funny, they're naturally good. They listen to the person reading to them. They can make a line funny, whereas a not talented actor could never do that. Barney Miller was a very specific show because it was hard comedy. There was nothing subtle about it. We used to say everybody was either neurotic or psychotic. Pick what you want, but that's what they were on that show. Hal Linden was a wonderful star to work with. He's still working to this day. I believe he's in his 80s, and he still works, and he still, I'm sure, thinks Barney Miller was the high point of his life.
Are there any particular guest actors that you discovered or that stand out for you during that time?
The ones that I thought were wonderful are not stars, they're working actors, so I don't think they would, be memorable to you. The series regulars on the show I did not cast. I came in after the pilot, as I mentioned. And so I don't really have those names to give to you.
And how would you find talent?
Well, the way it worked at that time was we had the Academy Players Directory from the Television Academy, and that had pictures of all the actors that were working actors at that time. They had character actors, leading men, younger leading men, children, and they all had agency representation. And an agent would pitch an actor to me, and I'd look them up and thought, oh, that's a good look, let's meet that person. And a lot of times agents would pitch actors to us. We'd tell them about the roles. This is also before the breakdown services. We didn't have that at the beginning. So you had to tell the agents what the roles were. Sometimes they would come and pick up a script. Of course, in Barney Miller, we never had scripts ahead of time, so that was a problem. And a lot of communication on the phone of what we're looking for and what they had to offer. And very quickly you met agents that became your friends, people that you trusted. And some of those agents I still work with now that are still doing it.
Would you ever go out to plays or things like that?
All the time. I went to small plays on Melrose. I was a very young casting director. I moved up in Barney Miller relatively early when Beth Uffner left, and so then I was in charge, and I was the casting director. And I didn't know a lot of actors for small roles, and I would go to the small plays at the Matrix and the Tiffany and all the small, there was a lot of small theaters on Melrose Avenue, and I would go to those plays. Very often I would be, my husband and I would go, and we'd be like half of 4 people in the audience. There'd be more people on stage than in the audience. But I learned about a lot of actors doing that kind of casting and being in plays and watching them.
So what was it that you liked about casting? Kind of what fed you?
It's very people-oriented. You're always talking and engaging with people. It's not about sitting by yourself writing a script. It's not about being a production assistant where you're worried about cameras and lighting and all that. It's all people. And I loved that. I loved talking with actors. I loved hearing their stories. A lot of our Barney Miller actors started in New York theater, and they always had great stories to tell, and I loved listening to them. I loved listening to the auditions. I loved when they made me laugh. And I just loved watching the performances.
So then you cast the Barney Miller spinoff, Fish.
I cast Fish, right, starring Abe Vigoda and Florence Stanley as his wife, Bernice. And then we cast all the children. It was the story of Fish was he and Bernice did not have enough money to retire, so they ran a group home for foster children. And of course we had no script, as was Danny Arnold's way. So I went to New York and I put kids on tape just being themselves. And I would interview them on camera that I ran myself, and talk to them, and they would tell me about themselves and what shows they've been on. And I had tapes and tapes of actors doing that and brought them back to LA and saw people in LA the same way. And Danny Arnold went through those tapes and picked kids he was interested in. By then we had a script and they would audition from the lines, and we picked a great cast. Unfortunately, none of them became very famous. They were good at the time, but they did not become famous. The show ultimately was not great and failed and was canceled after 13.
Now, had you stayed with Barney Miller for its full run?
No, I didn't. I left Barney Miller about 3 years in, and I was offered a job at MTM. And the head of casting, Meryl O'Loughlin, had been a Barney Miller fan and thought that the casting was very inventive. And she called me and said, I just love some of the people that you have on the show, and that there are people I've never heard of that are interesting. And I interviewed over there, and it was a very, very tough decision. But I left Barney Miller and went to MTM. At that time, MTM was shooting the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Bob Newhart. It had wonderful shows, and it was the height of television. And it was owned by Grant Tinker and Mary Tyler Moore. And I went to MTM, and I was there for 7 years. My first year I cast the Betty White Show, which was wonderful. Unfortunately, it didn't last. And Rhoda, the last 2 seasons of Rhoda, seasons 4 and 5. And that was really wonderful and a lot of fun. And I loved getting to know Valerie Harper and Julie Kavner, and the other actors on the show, and it was great. And it was run very different from Barney Miller. We actually had a script every week. We had an audience that came in every week, and it was a great background. When those 2 shows ended, I was asked to cast a wonderful show called The White Shadow for Bruce Paltrow, and now famous for being father of Gwyneth Paltrow, who was about 3 at the time. And he brought into the show, The White Shadow, Ken Howard, who was the star, and he was a basketball coach, retired from pro ball, who went to an inner city high school to coach basketball. And we found basketball players, actors who could play basketball in most cases. And we had some terrific actors on the show. Thomas Carter was the lead, and Kevin Hooks, Eric Kilpatrick, and I have to look
Van
them up.
Patten.
Timmy Van Patten was, yes, that was a very big deal at the time. What's really notable about White Shadow, in addition to being a really wonderful show that did well in syndication, where little kids would watch it after school for years and years after the show was canceled, is that Bruce Paltrow gave all the young actors a chance to direct. There again, that wasn't popular at the time. And he said to them, if you want to direct, I'll give you the opportunity if you put in the time. Meaning you go to editing, you go to casting, you go to story meetings, you go on the set, you sit with the director, you learn how to direct, and I will give you the opportunity. And that's how Thomas Carter and Kevin Hooks and Timothy Van Patten became world-class directors. Wow. They got their start on The White Shadow. Eric Launaville was another one that started on The White Shadow. And that was amazing. And thinking back on it, it was so amazing that Bruce Paltrow gave those young actors that opportunity. They didn't have any directing background. They hadn't gone to film school. They were actors, having a job on a local television show. So it was pretty great. And now, looking back on it, many, many actors have become directors on series television. I think Bruce was probably the first one to give that opportunity so much credence.
Talk a little bit about working with him. Did he have specific ideas about casting? Did he weigh in on everything?
Yes, and we did, again, no videotape, so every day we had casting. He loved actors. He was married to an actress, Blythe Danner, and he really enjoyed the people. And Bruce was so much fun. He was so collaborative. He was funny. He was charming. We all loved working for him. It was just a great ride. For 3 years we did that. And it was just a great show to work on. We had the basketball court was built on a set very close to our offices, so we could go down to the set every day. And we didn't have big guest stars. It wasn't that kind of a show. Occasionally we had other actors play basketball players, teachers. Probably our biggest guest star turned out to be Peter Horton, who played a young basketball player who was thinking that he might be gay, and that was, again, a big deal at the time. And Peter Horton, of course, went on to do 30-something and to become a very big director. So one of his first jobs was on The White Shadow. We were all really proud of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, was basketball a part of the audition process?
Yes, after we auditioned the actors, they would go down to the stage and play basketball. And they had to be able to play basketball, which luckily they all did. And it was so much fun to watch that.
That's great. So another MTM show you worked on was Hill Street Blues.
Yes, Hill Street Blues was the biggest show of my career and led to many great things in my future. It was the first show of a big ensemble cast like that. It was one of the first shows to use a handheld camera that was very gritty and moved a lot. And it was based on a show, it was I don't want to say based on, it was a show that Fred Silverman was interested in when he was at NBC, and he pitched it, the concept, to Stephen Bochco and Michael Kozel. They were the co-creators of the show. And they wrote that script, and it was amazing. There was nothing like it on television. It was the first of its kind. We had a great time casting it. It was not easy at all. Several of our actors were friends of Stephen Bochco from Carnegie Mellon, like Bruce Weitz, and that was, I'm not remembering the others right now, but that was the big one, was Bruce Weitz, who played Belker. And then we cast all the other characters, Veronica Hamill and as Joyce Davenport, and Daniel J. Travanti as Frank Furlow. And then Barbara Bosson, who was Stephen Bochco's wife, played Frank's ex-wife. She was terrific. She was Emmy nominated several times for that role. And then we filled out the ensemble on the show, and we had terrific people. Charlie Haid and Michael Warren. Charlie Haid actually was a guest star in the pilot, and at the end of the pilot it said, on a voiceover, Hill and Ranko, 1 DOA and 1 critical. And Charlie Haid had such a great time on the show, he went to Stephen and said, I want to stay with the show. And I remember we looped in the voiceover that said, Hill and Ranko, both critical. And so he became a series regular and ultimately a director on the show. And we just had wonderful time with actors. A really fun story that has really followed me is on Bruce Weitz as Belker. He was a very good friend of Stephen's, and Stephen wrote Belker with him in mind. And Grant Tinker said, look, I don't know this actor, and how do we know he can do this? So Stephen said, well, we'll set up an audition. So we were all in an office at MTM, and Bruce Weitz came through the door. He had the Belker hat on, he had the Belker gloves on. He looked horrible, it was grungy. And he ran in, he jumped on a desk, growled and looked around, and then jumped down and left the office. And Grant Tinker said, well, I'm not telling him he can't have this role. And that was his audition, and that's how he became Belker, which was amazing that anybody got away with that without saying one word, just growling. So we had great people on the show, and when at the screening, Stephen set up a screening for all of us at a screening room at MTM, and the lights came on, and it was dead quiet, and then everybody in the room just stood up and applauded. We had never, it makes me cry now, we had never seen a show like that that was so magical and so well done. And that's what it turned out to be. It changed television, especially dramatic programming was different after that. Big ensembles and grittiness and handheld cameras all happened after Hill Street Blues. So when the show was on the fall schedule and did not do well, it was very shaky for a long time, and then ended up getting like 19 Emmy nominations and was renewed with the lowest rating ever. And then it became a hit after the Emmy Awards that year. And I stayed with the show for 3 years after doing the pilot, and I loved it. It was really hard. We had huge casts every week, and we had junkies and cops and victims and old people and young people, and it was just grueling. When I think back on it now, I don't know how we could do that every week. It was like a little movie. And after 3 years, I felt it was time for me to move on to do other kinds of casting. I very honestly wanted to make more money. At that time, MTM had staff casting directors, meaning we worked all year round, but we were paid weekly, a salary. And now casting directors don't work like that. They get paid per episode, and they make a lot more money, even in proportion, than I made at that time. So I left after 3 years and became an independent casting director.
Now, did you have a team working with you, like
No.
casting associates that worked under you? Or?
No, I had an assistant and me, and that was it.
Wow.
And that's why it was so grueling. Nowadays, casting directors have a lot of people working for them. They have casting associates. We didn't have associates. We didn't have videotape. Every day at 3 o'clock was casting on Hill Street Blues. And if we didn't finish, we would cast the next day, and then the next day for the whole prep of the show. If we finished early, then I gave up the time. But that was my routine. So every day when I got back to my office after casting, I'd have to book the next day. And in the morning, I would do what we called pre-reads, and I would meet actors on my own. And then the best ones I would call back for the producer session. And every day casting was with the supervising producer, who was Greg Hoblet most of the time, and then whoever was directing that episode. The really great part of it is I learned a lot about directing because I sat there with the director while he redirected the talent and gave notes. Nowadays, with casting directors, so many actors are put on tape that you're not sharing time with the producers and with the director the way I did on Hill Street Blues. There was even times when an actor would read and Greg Hoblet would go get Stephen Bochco and say, listen to this audition. And Stephen would say, okay, I get it. I know what the adjustment is. And so actors help them get their characters right. And we call Stephen in. It's a different way to go, but we love this. And he would listen. And that's how we did some really wonderfully inventive casting on the show. So I love that. I learned a lot about directing. And we had a really good time because we were connected every day. And then the next day at 1:30, we watched dailies all together in a screening room. There again, that's all computerized now, but we all watched dailies together. So I think that all of us were more connected on the show than shows are now because we worked together so closely.
And are you the one reading lines with someone in the
Yes.
audition?
Yes, I read with all the actors. And you learn to like concentrate on what you're reading as well as listen to the audition. So you get kind of good at that. Casting directors now, some read with the actors, some have associates to do it, and some have readers, which is a very polite word for out-of-work actors. So, but I did read with all the actors, and I loved it, and it was enough acting for me to know that I never would want to do it on my own.
Would you get situations where people would come in and just get super flustered and flub it and ask to start over?
Yes.
What do you do in that situation?
You say, of course, and let them start over. Even now when we test actors at the CW, a couple times there'll be an actor say, I got off, can I start again? And we always say yes. I mean, this is their moment. These people are here taking their time to audition for us. I recognize how important it is and how tough it is to be on camera, as I'm doing now, and we always were great with second chances.
So at what point would the network weigh in? So if you'd said yes and Steven said yes, does someone from NBC also have to say yes?
Well, at that time, they said yes if it was series regulars, not if they were guest stars. Now, it's very different. And as a network executive, which I'll tell you more about later, I approve all guest stars on all of my CW shows. And I get videotapes, I watch them, and I approve them. And it wasn't like that then. The network only was involved if there were series regulars, like on the pilot of Hill Street Blues.
Okay, so then you became an independent casting director.
I did.
And how were you getting jobs at that point?
I was freelancing, getting recommendations. Coming off of Hill Street Blues was obviously a great credit, and I had a lot of calls from people saying, you know, do you want to meet on a project? You want to cast something? I did a lot of TV movies. I did some pilots. I did a wonderful little soap opera called Rituals. That was a syndicated soap opera, and I mentioned that because it was a really fun job, and that I really respect a lot of actors who come from daytime to make it in you make their careers. They become big stars in some cases, and it's not always easy for them to make the transition. So I like to think that they have the opportunity to go into primetime or go into features. Then a really nice thing happened. The casting director on Cheers left to go be an executive at NBC, as it happened. And Jimmy Burrows remembered me from casting Rhoda, and he brought me in to meet with the producers, and I got the job on Cheers. And it was season 3, and it was amazing. Now, I had done the best of drama with Hill Street Blues, and now I was doing the best of comedy, so that was pretty great. And it was an amazingly run, beautifully done show. I didn't cast the regulars, I came in season 3, but they were all terrific. And run-throughs were like a party, because it was like watching a Broadway play. They were all so good and so talented. Ted Danson and Shelley Long at the time were just terrific and had amazing chemistry. At the end of that season, Nick Colasanto passed away, and I recast when we added Woody Harrelson as Woody Boyd. And the really fun thing about that is the character was always named Woody Boyd, and Woody Harrelson got the part. And that doesn't come up very often. The name Woody is not very common. People thought we had changed the name because it fit him so well. That's not true. It was always Woody Boyd, and it was always to be played by Woody Harrelson. And he has gone on to do great things. That was his first big job. He had worked before, but that was his first big job. And after I did that, then I was recruited to go to NBC as Vice President of Talent and Casting. And I felt that it was an amazing opportunity. Joel Thurm was the head of casting. He loved that I was female because he had an all-male department up to that point. It was Brandon Tartikoff was head of the network at the time, along with Grant Tinker, who I knew from MTM. And Brandon liked that I was married, that I had children, and he thought that that's what the audience was made up of. So why not have a casting executive who comes from that world? So I went to NBC, and that was 1985, and I stayed for 14 years. And it was a big transition in my career.
So did you still work on Cheers then from the NBC side?
As a network executive, I did. And Hill Street Blues was still running at the time. And Joel Thurm was head of casting. 3 years in, he left to become a producer, and I was promoted to be the head of the department. And so for 11 years, I was the head of the department and was at NBC during an incredible run in history of must-see TV, where we did, the shows we did, looking back, were just the best. Cheers and Hill Street Blues were like the top, and then we added shows like Frasier and Seinfeld and Mad About You and Friends, ER. What am I forgetting?
We'll get to all of them. It's an incredible
Law and Order,
run.
LA Law, West Wing, pretty great show.
It is an incredible
In addition
show.
to that, I also want to mention that it was Brandon Tartikoff, and then he left the network, and Warren Littlefield took over. And he recruited and hired an amazing array of executives that have all gone on to be network and studio presidents, including David Nevins, Carrie Burke, John Landgraf, Dean Valentine, Kevin Riley. I shouldn't forget anybody here because that is a bad thing. I think I have everybody. And they went on, as I said, to do amazing things. And Warren had an eye for talent behind the camera and in front of the camera. And I just loved working with all those people and learned so much from them.
So Warren was heavily involved in the casting decisions
Heavily
as well?
involved, and he was great at casting, as was Brandon Tartikoff. And the auditions for series regulars were done in my office, and Warren or Brandon would sit at my desk, and we'd all crowd around and watch the auditions. And there was no videotape again, so there was no, you got one look, and that was it. And we decided on some really amazing people for the whole generation of must-see TV.
So just to finish off Cheers, so Shelley Long left in 1987, so were you involved in bringing Kirstie Alley on?
Yes, minimally, I have to say, because the producers always wanted her. And they did a screen test, and we saw it and loved her and went with it, and it was a great choice. And it was polar opposite of Shelley Long and added a new dimension to the show. Both ladies, wildly talented, and the show was great with both of them.
So how was casting at NBC structured? Like, did you oversee all dramas, all day parts, like all comedies?
I was in charge of all casting in prime time, which was comedy and drama. There was no reality shows. I also supervised TV movies and miniseries, of which there was about 40 a year. That's 40. It's a huge amount of product. We had movies on Sunday night and Monday night, and all year long. So there was a lot of movies. And we did also Saturday morning, which was really a lot of fun because it was all like teenage comedies. And that's where Saved by the Bell came from, which is a classic, is in syndication all over the world. It launched the careers of Mark Paul Gosselaar and Mario Lopez and Tiffany Amber Thiessen and Elizabeth Berkley, and Peter Engel was the producer, and it ran for a long time and was just a really fun part of my job because it wasn't taken as seriously as the primetime was. Within my department, I had a casting director that covered comedy who would spend her time, I think it was a female, all the times that I was there, at the Improv and at the Comedy Store. And this was at the time when Jerry Seinfeld and Ray Romano were becoming television sitcom stars. And so we would always watch them at the comedy clubs to try and discover new talent, as well as going to the Montreal Comedy Festival and finding new talent there. Then we had one person who was covering drama, and then one person who was all over the place for pilots. And we had a huge amount of work with the TV movies that had to be cast every week. So there were 7 of us in the department, and it was a great ride. Most of the people that worked for me stayed a long time. I didn't have too many people to replace. The assistants that we had, most of them went on to become casting directors later on, as well as the network executives that worked with us at NBC.
So when you would put together your team of casting executives, what did you look for in someone?
I tried to find people that had the love of casting that I had, that watched a lot of television and went to theater and went to movies and knew actors. Some great people came out of that era. Peter Golden, who went on to work at CBS for 24 years, and Bob Harbin, who took over casting at Fox, and Grace Wu, who is now head of casting at NBC for many, many years. It was, the assistants that we had were terrific. It just felt like people who had the same affection for what we were doing as I had. That's what I remember always looking for. One of the executives at the network I work for once said to me, people at network should be star players. In any job at the network, they need to be star players. So it's not a time for a passive person or a tentative person. It needs somebody who's interested, has a love of television, and it isn't afraid to take on everybody else to try and get their opinion out there and have a vote that mattered.
So when you took over from Joel, did you make any changes? Did you bring a certain strategy?
No, he had done a great job. I think I patterned myself after him. And the shows got better. I think that that was a big deal. Certainly NBC had a lot of good shows for a long time. Cheers, of course, being one of them, and Hill Street Blues, and I can't remember a lot of them now, but they had had good shows. But after 1985, I think it changed, and we just got better shows. Better writers came aboard. We were taking more chances. Warren Littlefield and Brandon Tartikoff were great at picking shows, and it was just a great time in the history of television.
And at what point would you typically attach talent? Like, would a project come to you with a name attached already? Or?
Sometimes, not usually, but sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes very early on we would pick an actor that we thought would be perfect for the role, but most of the time we cast all the roles. ER came in, and very soon after George Clooney was attached. That's an example. But Anthony Edwards and Noah Wyle and all the other people auditioned and got those parts. Mm-hmm. Well, and everybody on Friends, too, auditioned and got the parts.
All right, we're going to go through all those shows in details.
Okay.
So let's start, actually, you mentioned Jerry Seinfeld. So let's start with casting Seinfeld.
Obviously, Jerry was attached. And the characters were there. Elaine was not a part of the original cast. She came in episode 2. Jerry wanted a comedian to play his best friend George, and me, as well as some of the others, thought that that was a bad idea. Jerry was a comedian, not an actor, and we wanted to surround him with really good actors. And so that was how George Costanza was cast. He was a Broadway actor who had not done a lot of television. And help me.
Jason Alexander.
Jason Alexander. Oh, that's trouble. I didn't remember that. Came in and auditioned and got the part, and it was great casting. I mean, he and Jerry together were wonderful. I have a really nice story about Michael Richards. We were casting the rest of the pilot, and Brandon Tartikoff was on the way to go out of town, and there was a half hour that I had for him to meet Kramers and audition Kramers. We were all on the way to the Century Plaza Hotel where Bob Wright was being honored, and the half hour was all that Brandon could give me, but it had to be at the Century Plaza Hotel. And I reserved a room and got video equipment and had the actors come to the hotel and wait for us, and I had that half hour, and an actor came in, and then Michael Richards came in, and Michael Richards obviously got the part at a hotel room at the Century Plaza. That's never done, but it was that day, and it was wildly successful. After we cast the pilot and the show, so much has been written about the show, about what was good, what was bad, how 4 episodes were ordered, the money came from the specials department, and all that. We wanted them, NBC gave the note to add a female to the cast. And Julia Louis-Dreyfus had been in another series for us called Day by Day that Gary Goldberg produced. And Warner Brothers at the time had produced that show, but we knew her. And Castle Rock was the producers of Seinfeld. And they asked us about Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and because we knew her, we were excited about it and agreed to it. And she, of course, became a very, very important part of the show. She never auditioned. It was a straight offer based on her other work.
Is that rare for people to get a straight offer?
It's less rare now than it was then. It depends. Every situation is different. Certain actors are very high level, and so George Clooney did not audition for ER. He just got the offer. He had a deal with Warner Brothers, and so that worked out really well. And I can tell you many actors who audition for their parts. Most of the time they audition. Sometimes they don't.
So for Seinfeld, were Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David involved in all casting sessions as well?
Yeah. I remember Jerry being there. I don't remember Larry David. We're going back a lot of years here.
Yeah.
But I remember Jerry being there. I don't know if Larry David was or not. I have to ask somebody and they remember that. A lot has been written very recently about Rick Ludwin, who just passed away, and he was very much the executive who was behind Seinfeld. A lot has been written about him and how he sacrificed and stayed with the show and everything. And he was very much a part of that show and the success of the show.
So were there kind of rounds of auditions and yeses? Like, did Jerry say yes and then the network had to say yes for the series regular?
Well, we were all together
Okay.
in the same room,
Okay.
but ultimately it was not Jerry. It was Brandon Tartikoff at the time who said yes. He was a very high level and very famous television executive, and if he said he wanted a certain actor, it would be rare that anybody would say not so fast.
So your background having come from the kind of production company side and then being independent, how different was it being on the network side of things?
It's very different because you're not holding the actual auditions. I have a lot of respect for casting directors, and having been one and having observed so many talented ones, that I'm very careful to say, yes, I worked on Friends, I worked on Seinfeld, but at the network level. I was not the casting director on the shows. And we just look at things differently. Sometimes it's an economic thing about what actors we can afford, what actors we think will break out, which actors we've used before and had either a good or a bad experience. And so sometimes there's arguments, sometimes there's even battles, but ultimately the network is paying for the show and they have a lot of input about what they want and who they want to cast. And also depends on the status of the producer. Certain producers get what they want and other producers don't. But most producers and most studios want to please the network. They're the ones that are going to buy the show. So I like to think it's collaborative in most cases.
And are you involved in the actual negotiations with actors and agents and all that?
No, the casting director negotiates with agents for episodic guest roles, but series regulars have lawyers at the studios. I'm involved in budgets, but I don't actually negotiate any deals. There are times when they'll come to me and say a certain actor wants this amount of money, and I say, oh my God, that's a bargain, or I'll say, whoa, that's way too much money. So I'm involved on that level, but I don't actually negotiate anything.
So when you say budgets, is that the talent budget for a show?
Well, the overall license fee for a show includes a budget for actors. And we put together a budget estimating what we want to pay every actor. And there's going rates in a lot of cases for different roles and different, like for a drama or a comedy, or now, of course, reality shows have come in, so that's different.
Mm-hmm. And have those gotten adjusted over the years? I mean,
Yes, they go up a lot.
Yeah, I would imagine.
They go up a lot. And if an actor has proved himself on a show, if Michael Weatherly did NCIS for all those years and they want to do a show with him as the lead, he's in a very good negotiating position. So a lot of actors can make a lot of money, but then there's also the feeling that about 10% of Screen Actors Guild members earn a living wage. So it's really a very few that actually make big money. A lot of actors that I know want to be working actors. They don't need to be stars, but they want to be working actors. And that's kind of how I see it too.
Yeah. So let's talk about a few more shows. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was brought by Quincy Jones to our executives at NBC, and he had this young rapper named Will Smith that he wanted to star in the show to be the Fresh Prince. And Will's name at the time was Fresh Prince, and Jazzy Jeff was that was the rapper combo. And we all met on a Wednesday night at Quincy Jones' house in Bel-Air, because that was the only time that Will Smith could come to audition for us. And I sent a limo to the airport with one of my casting executives who was good at directing. And we had pages from an old script, because of course nothing was written yet. And he coached him in the limo on the way to Quincy Jones' house. Will came in, I read with him in Quincy Jones' basement, and he was adorable and wonderful, and he left, and we all looked at each other and said, let's do it. And that's how it started. Then they went and wrote the script and cast the rest of the actors. Will was in a limo on the way back to the airport to fly somewhere else for a personal appearance.
So did each of the other actors read with Will?
I don't remember.
That's fine.
It's a lot of
I know,
years
I'm asking
ago.
you to think way back.
It's a lot of years ago. I don't remember if they actually read with Will or not, but it was the usual casting process. Will was attached very early on, then they made the deals, and then they wrote the script. And it was a great show. It was so much fun. And every now and then when I catch an episode on television or something, I think, oh yeah, it was such a great show. The song was terrific. I mean, we really had a blast on that show.
The role of Vivian Banks was recast in the middle of the series. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was, there was conflict on the set between our original Aunt Viv and Will, and it just ended, and we recast. And yeah, it happens. It happens, you know, hopefully not a lot, but it does happen.
Yeah. Let's talk about Mad About You.
Mad About You was written with, Paul Reiser was a producer, and he picked Helen Hunt, which was golden, an amazing casting, and we filled in the other characters. But the show was the two of them, and I don't feel like I had a whole lot to do with it other than to say they're terrific. But I loved the show, and I loved working on it during the years at NBC.
Frasier.
Frasier, of course, came with Kelsey Grammer, and that was Kelsey had a deal with Paramount Television that whenever Cheers ended, he would be spun off into his own show, and that's how that happened. So we always knew it was going to happen. We just didn't know how long Cheers was going to run, and the producers on Frasier were the same producers from Cheers. They were A+ producers of comedy television, and they were great at casting too. The fun story of that one is that Lisa Kudrow was on Frasier playing Roz, and in the middle of rehearsal week of the pilot, they felt it just wasn't the right fit, and they fired her. And then they called me after and said, well, we fired Lisa Kudrow, we're going to recast. And of course that's not how it's done. It's usually called and we say we want to, and they didn't do that. They just fired her. They felt strongly, as Jimmy Burrows, the director, did, that it just wasn't right for the show. And they knew
Perry Gilpin.
Perry Gilpin from before, from Cheers, and they right away put her in that role. And they were right. It was magical. And we always think when we look back on it that if Lisa had stayed on Frasier, she would not have been available for Friends. So that was definitely something that was meant to be. The producers always had John Mahoney in mind. They flew to Chicago. He was a theater actor who didn't want to do television, and they convinced him to be the father. A really nice story, too, about David Hyde Pierce is the casting director on the show, Sheila Guthrie, brought them a picture of David Hyde Pierce very early on and said, doesn't he look a lot like Kelsey Grammer? And they agreed, and they met with him, and they wrote the brother for him. There wasn't a brother in the original show, the original concept of the pilot. So that was a fun one. And we filled out the cast. They had great guest stars on Frasier. Those producers had, first of all, they had great writing, and that attracted great people. And Frasier had many girlfriends through the run of the show, and they were all terrific. Bebe Neuwirth came later, and then that was again the producers who knew her from New York theater. And she was really spectacular in that role.
What about Jane Leeves as Daphne?
Jane Leeves, I believe they knew her from something else. It might have been from Cheers, and they cast her in that role. They just had a lot of ideas very early on that were great, and we went with them. So there wasn't a whole lot of casting the way there is on most shows.
So there was also a dog on Frasier, Eddie. Do you weigh in on animals
No, I don't
or
do
anything
animals.
like that?
No, I don't do animals.
Okay.
They had a trainer, and they picked Eddie, and Eddie was great, and nobody had any idea Eddie would become such a star, but he did, and it was a great part of the show, as was that lounging chair that the father sat in.
Yeah.
It's great.
So let's move on to Friends then.
Friends was just so much fun. It was such a great show. There's lots of stories been written about who got original offers, and they passed, and they have, I'm sure, lived to regret it. That's a hard show to know you passed on. Two of the actors on the show were in different pilots and weren't technically available. A lot has been written about Jennifer Aniston, and my great claim on that one was when we were struggling with the role of not Rachel but Monica, and I whispered in Warren Littlefield's ear, "Would you take Jennifer Aniston in second position?" And he looked at me and paused, and he goes, "Let's talk about it." Jennifer had been in several shows for NBC, and we loved her, and we knew she was a breakout, and we just weren't able to find the right show in the right space of time. And she had done a show for CBS that was sitting on the shelf. So that's why we felt it was a good, it was taking a chance, but it was a worthwhile chance to take her in second position. And then, of course, that show heard about Friends and aired, and it was a mess. And I handed a lot to Leslie Moonves and Warren Littlefield, who convinced everybody involved to release Jennifer and let her stay on Friends. Chandler, played by Matthew Perry, was also in a pilot that had already shot that season that I had heard was terrible. I don't know the name of it, nor would I say it. And we brought him in and took him in second position too, and that worked out well. And David Schwimmer was somebody the producers had written the part with him in mind, but he wasn't sure he wanted to do it. We had a very rough negotiation, but ultimately he said yes. Lisa Kudrow they had seen her on Mad About You playing a waitress, and they wrote that for her as well. When Jennifer Aniston was sent the script, she loved it, but she wanted to play Rachel, not Monica. And she was right. She was better for Rachel, and I really do credit her for knowing what she does best, because that was the perfect fit. Courtney Cox was cast at the very last minute. There was two contenders, and Warren Littlefield told the producers, "I'll leave it to you to decide between the two actresses." They took a walk, came back, and said Courtney Cox. And Matt LeBlanc came in to audition, much more in the conventional way. We all felt that if any one of the six had been different, it would not have been the hit that it was. And there's been lots written about it, how Jimmy Burrows took the whole cast to Las Vegas and said, "This is the last night before this show airs where you are not stars, and you'll be able to just go gambling and have fun, so enjoy yourselves." And I think the story goes he gave them each $200 or something. And it was magical and a hit right away.
How risky is it to put an actor in second position?
It's very risky. It definitely, there are stories where it hasn't worked and the original show gets the actor. So it's very risky, and it's not something we do lightly. It's rarely done because it can really mess up a show. Because like in the case with Jennifer Aniston, I mean, it's really important to the show, and we might have lost her. So yet had we not taken the chance, Friends wouldn't be Friends. So you have to weigh, the checks and balances of doing something like that. But
Well,
it's risky.
Yeah. What was it about her? You said you knew she was a breakout star.
There was a show we did called Blossom that starred Maya Bialik several years before Friends. And Don Rio, the producer, gave me a tape to watch of a pilot called Malloy that Maya Bialik had starred in, and said, "This is a girl I want for Blossom." And I'm watching it, and I'm thinking, yeah, she's really good. Who is that? And it was a girl playing Malloy's sister, and it was Jennifer Aniston. And as much as I loved Maya Bialik, and I still do, and we loved having her as Blossom, that pilot that I watched told me about Jennifer Aniston. She was not a star. She was not even known at the time. And we tracked her and cast her in. We did a show called Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Jennifer played the older sister. That was played by Jennifer Grey in the pilot, and in the movie, the feature. And we loved her in that. But the show didn't go. And then we cast her in a sketch comedy show, and the whole show went to another network, so we lost her on that. So it had been an actress that we had tried to cast several times before Friends. And that's why when I whispered that to Warren, he knew exactly who I meant, and we all believed in her potential.
Do you recall any of the other actors who were being considered or who passed on the list?
I believe it was Jamie Gertz that passed on Monica, and Craig Bierko, who passed on Chandler. And they both say they don't regret it, but that's hard to know. And it came down to each one being perfect for each role. So I don't remember like a second choice or anything like that.
So we've been chatting about an hour. Should we take a break or?